The court decision centered on a simple but powerful principle. Tariffs are not merely policy announcements. They function as taxes on imported goods. Under constitutional structure, the authority to create taxes belongs primarily to the legislature, not to a single office acting alone. The administration had relied on emergency economic powers, arguing that foreign trade conditions threatened national stability. However, judges carefully reviewed the legal language and concluded that those powers were designed for sudden and extraordinary crises, not for prolonged economic negotiation. The ruling explained that economic competition, even if intense, does not automatically qualify as a national emergency. By reaching this conclusion, the court was not debating economic philosophy, but interpreting statutory boundaries. Legal scholars emphasize that the judgment reinforces institutional balance, reminding policymakers that major financial measures must pass through established lawmaking channels. The decision therefore clarified the meaning of emergency authority and prevented its expansion into routine trade policy. The practical effect of the ruling extends beyond legal theory and directly affects businesses and citizens. For several years, companies had operated under uncertain import costs, adjusting contracts and production plans repeatedly. Manufacturers dependent on foreign raw materials faced higher expenses, and those costs often moved through supply chains to retailers and eventually consumers. The court recognized that long-term tariffs reshape markets in ways similar to legislation, which is why legislative approval is required. Judges also noted that emergency powers cannot replace debate and oversight because economic policy influences employment, investment, and household purchasing power. Following the decision, analysts began calculating potential reimbursement reviews and regulatory revisions. The ruling, therefore, not only limits future authority, but also restores predictability. Investors and trading partners interpreted the judgment as a signal that economic rules will follow transparent legal processes rather than sudden administrative action. In this way, the decision strengthens confidence in institutions and supports stable commercial planning. The tariffs had a measurable effect on cross-border trade because modern manufacturing depends on integrated supply chains rather than isolated production. Materials such as metals and industrial components often move back and forth across borders several times before a finished product reaches consumers. When import duties were introduced, companies faced sudden increases in operating costs. Some factories delayed expansion, others renegotiated contracts, and a few relocated production to avoid unpredictable pricing. Economists explain that tariffs rarely stay limited to importers. Instead, they influence the entire production network. Transport firms adjusted shipping schedules, wholesalers raised quotes, and retailers recalculated inventory purchases. Over time, uncertainty became as damaging as the tariffs themselves. Businesses require stable cost forecasts to plan hiring, investment, and equipment purchases. The court decision therefore removed not only a financial burden but also a planning obstacle. By restoring legal clarity, the ruling allowed companies to reconsider postponed projects and long-term agreements. Analysts observed immediate reactions in financial markets as expectations shifted towards steadier trade conditions and improved cooperation between neighboring economies. Households also experienced indirect consequences from the trade barriers. Import duties increased the price of raw materials, which raised manufacturing expenses and gradually affected everyday goods. Appliances, vehicles, and construction materials all reflected higher input costs. Although the change was gradual, consumers felt the impact through inflation and limited product availability. Economists noted that protective trade measures can benefit certain industries temporarily, but often transfer costs to the broader population. After the ruling, financial institutions began revising forecasts, predicting more stable price trends and improved supply reliability. Banks expected greater lending activity because businesses could again estimate future expenses with confidence. Exporters similarly anticipated renewed demand as foreign buyers regained competitive access to the market. The decision therefore supports both commercial recovery and consumer stability. By removing uncertainty, the legal outcome encourages trade planning based on predictable regulations rather than emergency declarations, strengthening economic confidence across the wider marketplace. Officials in Canada responded quickly after the legal decision became public. Their initial statements were measured and diplomatic, emphasizing respect for the judicial process rather than political victory. For several years, they had maintained that the tariffs lacked proper legal justification and disrupted a long-standing trading partnership. The ruling confirmed that argument without requiring further dispute. Government representatives announced readiness to coordinate with customs authorities to update procedures and remove countermeasures introduced during the conflict. Trade ministries began consultations with industry groups, especially metal producers and exporters, to prepare for normalized market access. The reaction was carefully framed around stability and cooperation, highlighting that predictable rules benefit both sides. Analysts observed that such messaging was designed to reassure investors and prevent market volatility. By avoiding celebratory rhetoric, officials signaled a desire to restore trust, rather than deepen disagreement. The response showed how legal resolution can reduce diplomatic tension, allowing governments to move forward using a shared legal interpretation, rather than competing political narratives. Economic agencies in Canada also moved to practical matters immediately. Financial regulators examined how customs collections and import documentation would change once the tariffs were withdrawn. Exporters started reviewing contracts that had been paused due to uncertain pricing conditions. Some manufacturers had shifted production schedules or sought alternative buyers during the dispute, and the ruling allowed them to reconsider earlier trade routes. Market confidence improved as businesses anticipated steadier demand from cross-border customers. Economists there predicted gradual recovery rather than sudden expansion, noting that companies required time to rebuild supply arrangements. Officials also expressed willingness to discuss joint standards and regulatory alignment to prevent future disruptions. The overall approach emphasized predictability, transparency, and long-term partnership. By responding with administrative preparation instead of confrontation, the government aimed to protect commercial continuity and signal that cooperation remains the preferred path in managing complex economic relationships. The legal ruling carries significance beyond one bilateral dispute because international trade depends on predictable rules. Global commerce functions through agreements that require governments to justify restrictions with clear evidence. When tariffs are introduced under broad national security claims, other countries often question whether the measures are economic protection rather than genuine safety concerns. Trade specialists observe that the court's interpretation limits the ability to apply emergency reasoning to ordinary market competition. By clarifying that extraordinary powers must be narrowly defined, the judgment aligns domestic practice more closely with widely accepted international standards. This helps reduce the risk of escalating disputes because partners gain confidence that trade barriers will follow legal procedures. The decision therefore contributes to stability in the wider trading system. Analysts noted that businesses prefer operating in environments where policies are guided by law instead of sudden announcements. As a result, the ruling not only resolves a particular disagreement, but also strengthens expectations that economic measures must be justified and transparent. Other nations carefully reviewed the judgment as a potential precedent. Legal experts believe domestic courts can indirectly influence global economic behavior because governments must consider the risk of legal challenges before introducing sweeping trade restrictions. If policies are likely to be overturned, officials may seek negotiation or legislative approval instead. This encourages consultation rather than retaliation, reducing the cycle of countermeasures that often follows unilateral tariffs. Trade organizations also see the decision as reinforcing cooperative frameworks, since consistent legal interpretation supports mutual confidence among partners. Economists emphasize that long-term growth depends on reliable access to markets and steady regulatory conditions. By narrowing the definition of emergency authority, the court helps protect that reliability. The outcome therefore affects more than two countries. It supports a broader environment where commerce operates under clear legal boundaries and predictable obligations, allowing governments to resolve disagreements through rules and dialogue rather than abrupt economic pressure. The political and diplomatic consequences of the ruling are substantial because trade disputes often extend beyond economics into broader strategic relationships. When tariffs are imposed between close partners, tensions can affect cooperation in areas such as security coordination, environmental initiatives, and regional infrastructure planning. By resolving the legality of the tariffs through judicial review, the court created a neutral reference point that allows both governments to step back without appearing to concede political ground. Diplomats now have an opportunity to shift discussions away from retaliation and toward constructive planning. Officials are expected to revisit joint economic forums and technical working groups that had slowed during the dispute. Observers note that legal clarity can sometimes succeed where prolonged negotiation stalls because it removes ambiguity and sets defined boundaries for future action. This ruling therefore provides a reset in tone, encouraging dialogue built on statutory interpretation rather than political disagreement. In practical diplomatic terms, the decision reduces pressure on leaders who previously faced domestic criticism over trade policy. With the tariffs declared unlawful, policymakers can justify policy adjustments as compliance with judicial authority rather than political compromise. This distinction matters in democratic systems, where public perception influences negotiations. Analysts predict that upcoming meetings will focus on long-term industrial cooperation, regulatory alignment, and shared economic resilience rather than defensive measures. Business councils on both sides are preparing recommendations aimed at strengthening supply chain integration and reducing vulnerability to future disputes. The ruling also reinforces the credibility of institutions, demonstrating that legal systems remain active participants in shaping economic governance. Over time, this may encourage governments to prioritize consultation with legislative bodies before implementing major trade restrictions. The broader diplomatic impact, therefore, lies not only in removing specific tariffs, but in fostering a more stable framework for resolving future disagreements through established legal and institutional channels. Financial markets responded swiftly once the court's decision became public, reflecting how closely investors monitor trade policy. Stock indexes connected to manufacturing, transportation, and raw materials showed noticeable movement as traders recalibrated expectations. For years, uncertainty surrounding import duties had influenced pricing models, long-term contracts, and expansion strategies. When tariffs increase costs unpredictably, companies often delay hiring, reduce capital investment, or adjust supply chains to manage risk. The ruling signaled that a significant source of uncertainty had been removed. Market analysts described the reaction not as celebration, but as recalculation. Investors prefer stability over sudden shifts, and the court's clarification offered a clearer regulatory outlook. Bond markets also reflected moderate adjustments as inflation expectations were reassessed. If import costs decline over time, price pressures may ease gradually. Currency markets responded with measured strengthening tied to export sectors, as traders anticipated improved cross-border trade volumes. Overall, the response illustrated how legal decisions can influence economic confidence almost immediately. Institutional investors, including pension funds and multinational corporations, began reviewing sector forecasts in light of the ruling. Industries heavily dependent on imported components, such as automotive and construction equipment manufacturing, are expected to benefit from more predictable cost structures. Banks projected increased lending activity if companies revive expansion plans that were previously postponed. However, analysts caution that adjustments will occur gradually rather than instantly. Contracts must be renegotiated, inventories recalculated, and regulatory updates formally implemented. Some domestic producers who had temporarily benefited from reduced foreign competition may face renewed market pressure. But economists argue that broader economic growth depends on balanced trade rather than prolonged protection. The decision, therefore, reinforces the principle that predictable legal frameworks encourage investment. By removing contested tariffs through judicial review, the market receives a signal that economic governance remains grounded in statutory limits, helping businesses and investors plan with greater confidence and reduced long-term uncertainty. The ruling also establishes an important precedent regarding executive authority in economic policymaking. Courts rarely invalidate broad trade measures, which is why legal scholars view this judgment as particularly significant. The central issue was not whether tariffs can ever be used, but whether emergency powers may substitute for legislative approval in long-term economic strategy. Judges concluded that emergency authority must remain limited to immediate and clearly defined threats. Economic competition, even when politically sensitive, does not automatically meet that threshold. By drawing this distinction, the court reinforced the principle of separation of powers. Lawmakers are responsible for taxation and sustained economic regulation, while executive action is intended for urgent situations requiring quick response. This clarification reduces ambiguity for future administrations and establishes legal boundaries that must be considered before imposing wide-ranging trade restrictions. Analysts believe policymakers will now consult legislative bodies more carefully, knowing that courts may review the legal basis of similar measures. The precedent extends beyond tariffs into other areas of economic governance. Future decisions involving technology controls, energy imports, and strategic resources may be evaluated under the same reasoning. Government agencies must now demonstrate specific and immediate risk if they invoke emergency authority. This requirement encourages documentation, transparency, and inter-branch consultation before policy implementation. Legal experts argue that such oversight strengthens institutional credibility because economic actions affect employment, investment, and international relations. Businesses also benefit from clearer expectations about how regulations will be introduced and challenged. Rather than facing sudden policy shifts, companies can anticipate that major measures will involve legislative debate and public scrutiny. Over time, this decision may reshape how leaders design economic initiatives, emphasizing statutory authorization instead of rapid unilateral action. The broader impact, therefore, lies not only in a single case, but in defining how authority is exercised when national economic interests and legal limits intersect. The long-term outlook for regional trade now appears more stable because integrated supply networks depend on predictable policy conditions. Modern manufacturing across the continent operates through coordinated production, where raw materials, components, and finished goods cross borders multiple times before reaching consumers. The removal of disputed tariffs allows these networks to function with fewer disruptions. Companies can once again calculate transportation costs, delivery timelines, and inventory needs with greater confidence. Economists expect investment decisions that were postponed during the dispute to be reconsidered, particularly in sectors such as automotive assembly, construction materials, and heavy equipment. Government agencies are also likely to revisit joint infrastructure projects that support trade corridors, including rail, ports, and customs modernization. The ruling, therefore, encourages practical cooperation by reducing uncertainty rather than dramatically changing policy direction. Businesses generally prefer steady regulatory environments, and the legal clarity now provides a foundation for planning production and expansion over several years instead of reacting to sudden announcements. In addition, policymakers are expected to explore updated agreements addressing emerging economic areas. Digital commerce, energy exchange, and environmental standards have become central topics in modern trade discussions. With the tariff dispute resolved legally, officials can focus on coordinating regulations instead of defending retaliatory measures. Analysts predict gradual improvements in market confidence as companies rebuild supply relationships and reopen procurement channels. Consumers may benefit from more consistent product availability and moderated price pressure once supply chains stabilize. However, specialists emphasize that recovery will take time because trade networks require contractual adjustments and logistical recalibration. The broader significance lies in renewed trust between trading partners, which supports entrepreneurship and cross-border investment. By clarifying legal limits and restoring cooperation, the decision offers an opportunity for sustained economic interaction guided by predictable rules, encouraging long-term planning rather than short-term protective responses. Another important dimension of this development is its impact on public confidence in institutions. When major economic policies are challenged and reviewed through the judicial system, citizens are reminded that decisions affecting national markets are not beyond scrutiny. The court's ruling demonstrates that even complex trade measures must withstand legal examination. For many observers, this reinforces trust in constitutional processes and the idea that economic authority is distributed rather than concentrated. Public debate surrounding the tariffs had been intense, with businesses, workers, and consumers expressing differing concerns. By issuing a detailed interpretation grounded in statutory language, the judiciary provided clarity that political argument alone could not settle. Analysts note that transparency in reasoning is essential for democratic legitimacy, particularly when policies influence prices, employment, and international relations. The ruling therefore contributes to institutional credibility, showing that disagreements over economic direction can be resolved within established legal frameworks rather than through prolonged political confrontation. This renewed confidence may also shape civic engagement and policy discussions moving forward. Lawmakers are likely to face greater expectations for oversight when future trade measures are proposed. Advocacy groups and industry associations have seen that legal challenges can meaningfully influence economic governance. As a result, consultation processes may become more inclusive, with broader participation before major restrictions are implemented. Economists suggest that predictable legal review reduces the likelihood of abrupt shifts that unsettle markets and households. Citizens benefit when policies are debated openly and justified clearly, because transparency supports informed decision-making. Over time, the precedent may encourage administrations to prioritize collaboration with legislative bodies to avoid similar disputes. The broader effect is not dramatic transformation, but gradual strengthening of institutional balance. By reaffirming that economic power operates within defined boundaries, the decision supports a system in which policy direction is shaped by law, oversight, and public accountability rather than sudden executive action. The final key point focuses on the broader implications for economic planning and regional resilience. When tariffs or trade barriers are imposed unpredictably, businesses and governments must adapt reactively, often with costly adjustments to supply chains, staffing, and investment strategies. The court's ruling provides a framework for more predictable economic governance, allowing companies to plan with a clearer understanding of legal constraints. Manufacturers that depend on cross-border sourcing can resume long-term contracts, while service providers can anticipate stable demand from industries that had reduced operations due to uncertainty. Analysts highlight that reliable policy environments encourage investment in innovation, infrastructure, and workforce development. By clarifying that emergency powers cannot replace legislative approval for extended economic measures, the decision emphasizes that strategic planning must operate within legal boundaries. This approach benefits not only individual companies, but also the broader regional economy, which relies on coordinated industrial activity and shared regulatory standards. In addition, the ruling encourages governments to focus on cooperation and resilience rather than reactive protectionism. With tariffs removed, agencies can revisit collaborative projects in transportation, energy distribution, and technology exchange that had stalled due to policy uncertainty. Public and private stakeholders gain confidence that decisions will follow established procedures, reducing the likelihood of sudden shocks to markets or households. Economists note that long-term regional growth depends on this stability. When trade and investment decisions can be made with legal certainty, businesses are more willing to expand operations and explore new markets. Consumers benefit indirectly through stabilized prices and more consistent availability of goods. While the decision does not resolve all economic challenges, it establishes a foundation for measured, law-based approaches to trade policy. Over time, predictable legal frameworks allow governments, businesses, and communities to plan for growth, respond to market changes thoughtfully, and maintain resilient economic systems that are less vulnerable to abrupt, unilateral policy shifts.